In the last lecture, we set up our account service and hooked it up in our app, and still, our app seems to be broken. If I click these buttons, the status is not changed. So somehow our code is not working. Actually, it's working correctly. We're just using services wrong here. In this specific case, we're not using the service in the way we should use it in our app. What's going wrong? The Angular dependency injector actually is a hierarchical injector. That means that if we provide a service in some place of our app, let's say on one component, the Angular framework knows how to create an instance of that service for this component and, important, all its child components. And actually, this component and all its child components and the child components of the child components will receive the same instance of this service. There are other places where we can provide a service too. The highest possible level is the app module. We haven't done this yet, but we will see this soon. If we provide a service there, the app module does have a providers array. The same instance, and that's important, the same instance of the class of the service is available in our whole app, in all components, in all directives, in all other services where we maybe inject a service. Yes, we can inject services into services. I'll come back to this. The next level, for example, would be the app component. There, the app component and all its child components do have the same instance of the service. And this is true for any component. So even if we have a child of the app component, if we provide it on that child, all the children of this child will have the same instance and the child itself, but not the app component. The instances don't propagate up. They only go down that tree of components. The lowest level, therefore, is a single component with no child components. If we provide a service there, this component will have its own instance of the service, and well, it doesn't have any child components, so this instance will only be available for this component. And this will actually even override if we were to provide the same service on a higher level. And that's exactly what we're doing. So let's take a closer look in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we learned about that hierarchical injector. And actually, this injection behavior leads to the behavior we see here. Now, that's not a bug, that's intended. You might have an application where you want to have many different instances of the same service, where you absolutely don't want to have the same instance. But sometimes you want to have the same instance. And we definitely do. Because right now, for our account service, we have 3 instances. The first one gets created here in app component. We provide it here. App component receives its own service, or its own instance of the service, I should say, as do all the child components. Now you might say, fine, because new account and account are child components. Right. But there we provide it again, and hence we override the instance we would get from the app component. Now new account and account component have their own instances. So these are the other 2 instances of this service class. And therefore, if we add a new service, we call add account. There we push it on this array of accounts, and this actually works, but it's a totally different instance of the service than the one we use here in app component, the one through which we loop. How can we fix it then here for our app? Simple. We just remove it from the provider's array. Don't remove it from the constructor. We of course do need it here because that tells Angular that we want an instance. The provider's array basically tells which instance, so there we needed to remove it. And the same for account component. Leave it in the constructor, leave the import at the top, but remove it from the provider's array. With that little change, if we go back to the application after saving it, let's add another account. Now you see it at the bottom. Now you can change the status again. So this is the difference. Different instances of the service. Now we're using one and the same, before we weren't. Both may be the behavior you want in your app, but make sure that you get the correct one. In the last lecture, we learned about this hierarchical injector and that we can choose between one instance or multiple instances of the same service class. I mentioned that the highest possible level is actually not the app component. So let's remove it here, this providers array, leave it in the constructor and leave the import. But the highest possible level is in the app module. Here we also have a providers array, add it if you don't have it. And here we can also provide the accounts service. Make sure to also add the import at the top here then. With that little addition here, we're making sure that our whole application, everything in our application, receives the same instance of the service unless it overrides it as we did before. Now with that, we can now even inject a service into another service. Because that's not possible by providing it on a component level. For that, we need to provide it in the app module. So let's say we want to log something if we call an action in the account service. So I would have to provide the logging service in my app module now. And therefore, I will simply comment out providers here in my add component decorators. And I don't want to call logging service here anymore, so we'll comment this out, and I will actually leave the injection here so that you have it for reference if you download the code. I'll also comment it out here in new account component. Instead, let's say I want to use this logging service in the account service, and I might want to call the log status change method there, because this is in the end the place where the status changes, either because we added a new account or because we called update status. So to use the service there, generally we start in the same way. We add a constructor and we inject our logging service in this case, set the type, import this type at the top, make sure to add the import, and we provided it in app module. So you could think that we are set to go, that we can now go to add account, call logging service, log the status change, pass the status here, and do the same here for update status. You could think this is how we do it, and it's not unlogical to think so, but let's see if this works. If we load our app, we already get an error. Can't resolve all parameters for account service. Something's not working. The reason is if you inject a service into something, this something needs to have some metadata attached to it. Now, a component has some metadata because we have add component. A directive has some metadata because we have add directive. A service doesn't have any metadata. It's just how Angular works that we need to attach some metadata. And of course, not any metadata. You shouldn't attach add component here. There is a specific metadata you should attach in such cases. It's add injectable, which needs to be imported from @Angular core. This tells Angular that now this service is injectable, or that something can be injected in there, to be precise. So that's important. You don't add injectable to the service you want to inject, but to the service where you want to inject something. So the receiving service, you could say, the to be injected in service. And you don't need to add it to any other service. If you don't want to inject anything in a service, like here for the logging service, you don't need to add injectable. Only add it if you expect to get something injected. Now, one important note here, as I explained, we don't need to add injectable, the injectable decorator here to this class, because this is a service which we only inject somewhere else, but where we don't inject anything into this service. And you technically really only need injectable if you inject something into this service, not if you just inject this service somewhere else. In newer versions of Angular, however, it is recommended that you always add injectable. It technically makes no difference right now. In the future it might though, so it's already a habit you might get into that you add it. Here I do omit it, but you could consider adding it also to ensure that in the future it doesn't unexpectedly break. What I explained about why you need it and that you don't need it here technically still holds though. With this, if I now save this and we let the app reload, now it works. And now you see that if I save this, we still log it to the console with the correct status. The same happens if I click here, but now everything is centralized into our service, and now we're also injecting a service into a service. We talked a lot about services in this module, and I hope you saw how services can clean our app up, make the code a bit leaner, more centralized, easier to maintain. You don't have to build these complex output-input chains where you pass events and properties to get data from component A to component B. It's much leaner now. Let me show you how much we actually saved. Let's say that if we click on the button here in the account component, for some reason, we want to output something in the new account component. Normally, without services, we would have to emit an event in the account component that something was clicked or something happened so that we changed the status, for example. We would have to catch the event here in app account. As a side note, we can of course remove these events here. They aren't triggered anymore. So we would have to catch these events here. And then we would have to pass the new data down via property binding to the component where we want to handle it. Pretty complicated. And building these chains of property and event binding is not the most convenient way of writing code. It's so much easier with services. Let's say in our account service here, we want to provide some event which we can trigger in one component and listen to in another. So we could simply add the status updated event, which could be a new event emitter, which we import from @AngularCore. So make sure to add this import at the top, which will pass on the new event, the new status, so a string. And yes, we could trigger it now here in the update status method. But we can also, since we inject the account service here where we set the new status, call account service status updated and emit this with the new status. So now I'm emitting an event I set up in the service. And as a side note, later in the observable section, you will learn about another construct you can use to submit or to emit events and subscribe to it instead of using the event emitter. But for now, that's absolutely fine. So here we are emitting an event. Again, the event emitter lives in our service. And in the new account, I now want to listen to it. So here, let's say I want to throw an alert. So I will do this in a constructor for now, access my account service. And now for the status updated event here, I will subscribe to it because event emitter in the end just kind of wraps an observable. So here, I could then receive the new status, which I know will be a string, and then I will simply throw an alert where I say new status, something like that. So now I'm not building any chain of property and event binding. I do have cross-component communication through a service with the event emitter. And you can see this if I click a button here. They actually got opened on another window, but you see this alert was thrown with the new status unknown. Same here, inactive, active. So now we're communicating between components through a service, which really can save you a lot of time. And with that, I hope you saw a lot of reasons why services can be very helpful and how you can use them to your advantages. Make sure to use the right amount of instances. And if you inject services into services, make sure to provide the service on the app module level and to add injectable to the service where you want to inject it in. Let's move on to some assignments now.